Hey everyone, we're back here for part two. Again, I'm using a new screen capture tool here, so just getting used to the buttons and the length of the recording and uploading and all that kind of stuff. So, okay, we were talking about setting. Again, setting isn't just de facto where a story occurs, but when we think about setting, we want to also think about how the choices that the authors made about not just literal setting, like what city we're in or what streets are being named and that kind of stuff, but things that are implied, the way that an atmosphere or mood is created through setting, and how that can help to further the theme of the story, right? So even in like flight patterns, for example, it's a story about repetition and patterns, and potentially breaking out of those patterns and habits. And we're told, I think quite early on, that the sky is really gray and it's just a subdued, not very inspired atmosphere. So that could be literally true. We're in Seattle after all, in that story. But it's also contributing to that sense of just like, I don't know, plainness, for example. So again, as you look for details of setting, don't just look for the literal details, but think about how they're connected to or contributing to the overall theme and sort of message of the story. Conflict I mentioned, right? There's lots of ways that these can be interpreted. And truthfully, most good short stories will involve overlapping versions of, all of this kind of stuff. Theme that I mentioned already, so I'm just going to come back to this plot idea. Plot might seem like the most obvious or kind of like entry point for a story, but in many ways, it can be the most complicated. And by complicated, I don't mean like difficult to understand, but the most interesting or the most productive way for us to think about a story. So we're going to use this theory or this diagram that was developed by this Freytag person, if you've ever heard that name before. He was a literary theorist, among other things. And it might seem kind of straightforward that, most, if not all, short stories are built the same way. There's what's called exposition, or kind of like laying the groundwork. We learn about the characters, where we are, just some introductory stuff. We have some rising action, right? The tension is growing. We're sensing something's going to happen, but we're not really sure what maybe. There's that moment of climax or conflict or confrontation maybe, and it doesn't have to be like violent or physical. It can be, if it's like a man versus self, or person versus self, it can be a very internal, quiet, unvoiced kind of a thing, but it's sort of that moment in the story. And then, so Freytag posited, we would have this sense of falling action, and then this denouement, French for, the end. Everything sort of quiets down. So that was the theory that he developed about how short stories generally worked, modeled actually after the 5-act play, with, right, act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 finally taking us to the end. Okay, so easy enough to look at, right, just on paper. And of course, he developed a lot more ideas than just this, rather than a simple, pyramid. But that's what we're going to use to do our exercise for this particular unit. So we're going to take this idea, the Freytag pyramid, and then see if we can apply it to the two short stories. So this is the assignment. Again, set up as a discussion board. The main assignment is described here. So what I want you to do, and you can just do this by hand if you don't want to bother with the technology, is take two pieces of paper, orient them landscape so they're sort of like lengthwise to you, and then draw out the pyramid, but do it in a way that you think actually reflects both Alexei's flight patterns and where are you going, where have you been, the other story we're reading for this unit, right? So don't just draw the perfectly symmetrical pyramid, because, and this is really the interesting part, is to map a story against that pyramid and figure out where we would put each of these different kind of pieces. And of course, what you find in many stories is that there's not just one single moment that happens necessarily, but often within this rising action, we have that growing tension through a series of almost like micro conflicts. But in most good short stories, there's not a ton of super dramatic things that happen. There's one often fairly muted thing, but it's sort of that turning point, the moment in the story. So figure out or decide for yourself where you think these things happen in each of the stories. So not only is it an interesting way to think about short fiction, but what we'll see as we begin to post our work to the discussion board is that different people can have very different interpretations of how the pyramid looks and where each of these pieces might fit, or even what we would deem to be the major moment of conflict that happens in the stories. So like I say in the assignment here, it's not so much a test to see, did our authors conform to the quote unquote right diagram here. It's how do authors manipulate each of these pieces to create interesting stories, right? To extend exposition, for example, to heighten rising action, to extend the rising action, to move that major point of conflict to different places in the story, and then how does that affect all the other pieces? And again, we get to see different interpretations and how people defend those interpretations. So again, just by hand if you want, or you can get fancier, doesn't matter. Draw the pyramid and then label it with a little description for each of the pieces here. And then take a picture, and we want to post those to our discussion board. So again, going back up here to access the discussion board. And then there's more of a writing assignment here that asks you to explain your pyramid. Why did you draw it the way that you drew it? And again, be sure to quote from the actual text, so we have the language of the authors being included in our discussion here. And you're doing it for both short stories. And again, this is a good comparative tool as well, because we can see how two, what I would consider to be effective and compelling short stories, use these pieces, but in very different relationships to one another. So that's another interesting thing to see. Okay, so once again, thinking about our due date system. So this pyramid exercise due by our next Thursday due date, and then you'll see, again, responding to other posts would be due by that Sunday. Again, not that you have to wait up until those due dates to be posting your work. Okay, so as we get deeper into the course here, by all means be in touch if you have questions about the content, if you're having technical issues or anything else is going on. It's really important that you feel comfortable being in touch with me, and I always try to get back to people as soon as possible. We can meet virtually to look at stuff in real time. We can meet face-to-face if you're on campus to look at stuff in real time. But hopefully, especially as we get into Unit 2, you're starting to get a lot more comfortable with the layout of the course. You've had the opportunity then after Unit 1 to sort of meet some of your classmates. So we turn our attention away from just navigating the course and getting situated and oriented to really diving into the course content itself. All right, so I'll talk with everybody soon, and I hope you have a good weekend.